Hi, I'm Jim Reilly, and welcome to Worse, Tales of Strength and Endurance from the Old Days. Times are tough, but we'll get through this. We've been through worse. Tonight on Worse, we're going to be looking at Chilean miners, no air conditioning, and hookworm. And while we're talking about these choice subjects, I'm going to be enjoying a Steel Reserve beer from the Steel Brewing Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and having an apple empanada from our local farmers market. So if you want to grab something to eat, please do. Sit down by the fire with me. We'll get started. All right. So in August of 2010, at the San Jose mine in northern Chile, there was a huge collapse. The tunnels were blocked. There was no communication with the miners that had been down inside of the mine. And the first attempts to reach them after this collapse were through air shafts that were still open, but a subsequent collapse blocked them as well. What they found out later was that a piece of rock about the size of the Empire State Building had broken loose from within this network of tunnels and shafts and had blocked access to the lower parts of the mine. There were people in there, and there was no way to reach them or even to know if they were alive. But many drilling rigs were brought in immediately, and these were able to drill 3-inch diameter holes. So they first drilled a hole down to where they knew to be a tunnel at about 1,000 feet of depth, and they found nothing. There was no response. At another location, they drilled down to a 1,600 foot deep tunnel, and again, nothing. And then at the very bottom of the mine, there was a refuge chamber at about 2,300 feet. One of these narrow shafts drilled down, missed it by about 100 feet. But then after 17 days, another shaft broke through into something, and the engineers thought that they might hear banging on the drill bit thousands of feet below them. So they withdrew the bit, and there was a note attached that the 33 men who had been lost in the mine were all still alive. These men were living at this point in starvation conditions. The food that they had with them made it possible for each of them to have only a sip of milk and a spoonful of tuna from a can every other day. They were living on about 300 calories a day, and that was, of course, not enough to sustain life. They were drinking water that had become caught in the bucket of a front end loader. Think of a bulldozer, but something with a scoop on the front. And that was the water they could drink. It was about, at that depth, I don't know if you know this, but the deeper you go in a mine, the hotter it gets. And at that depth, it was about 95 degrees. And the humidity was an almost constant 95%. The walls were dripping with humidity. And one of the things that a scientist pointed out was that in that environment, because there's no ultraviolet light like there is from the sun, bacteria is not getting killed in the way that it does on the surface of the earth. So that made the danger of infection and disease even greater. So through this narrow 3-inch shaft, they were able to send down small packets of nutrient-dense food. And the plan was low and slow. And in this, the Chilean government very wisely consulted NASA. Now, I don't know why NASA would be the experts on this, but what NASA pointed out to them was that a sudden increase in carbohydrate intake after a period of starvation can result in what's called refeeding syndrome, where the body attempting to process this sudden infusion of unaccustomed carbohydrates causes an imbalance of other electrolytes and fluids in the system that can lead to heart arrhythmia and even cardiac failure. So the men were slowly brought back to a healthy diet. But now the challenge was a far greater one. How do they drill a shaft large enough to bring those men up and to get them back home? So plan A was a drilling rig brought in from not very far away to to drill a rescue hole, the process was very slow. It was the nature of this bit that in order to function properly for lubrication, it required 20 liters of water per second. And what I didn't tell you is that the San Jose mine was in the Atacama Desert, which according to one account I read is the driest place on earth. So there was a place about an hour away where a deep well had been dug, and there was a constant convoy of trucks going back and forth to provide this drilling rig with enough water to keep itself going. But it was estimated that it would take 3 months to get the men out. So then it was Plan B. There was a guy named Brandon Fisher, and he heard about this story up in Pennsylvania, where he worked for a company. In fact, he was the president of a company called Center Rock Inc., which made drill bits. And he heard about it, and he said, I think I can help him. Turned out his wife, who also worked for Center Rock Inc., at a trade show had met a representative of the Chilean trade delegation. She contacted them. Brandon was put in touch with the Chilean government. He explained their plan, and within a few days, he was down at the San Jose mine. So they went with a drilling rig by a company called Schramm, which is also a Pennsylvania-based company. And Center Rock had created a bit especially made to do this. Here's the trick. Center Rock's bits are usually used for drilling, I don't think at that depth, but they're not a steerable bit, which amazingly is something that is the case in the petroleum industry and the natural gas industry. They can steer a drill bit, but Center Rock's bits aren't steerable. So what they did was, on this drill bit that was drilling a hole wide enough to get these men out, they put a pilot bit on it that would fit in one of the existing 3-inch holes that got down to these guys. And so it could follow the 3-inch hole as it did its work, which is just an amazing way of getting a drill bit down that deep and to have it come in on target. So they were considered Plan B. Plan B's drill bit broke. And here's the thing, that broke when it was hundreds and hundreds of feet down. So now the old drill bit was blocking the hole and making it impossible for them to use this process of following the 3-inch hole as a pilot hole, even if they're able to get back down to it with a brand new bit. So a third rig was brought in. This was Plan C. It was a huge Canadian rig that was not in use but was in storage someplace else in Chile. So this took 9 days to set up. It needed enough room of like a soccer field to set up its whole thing. It stood well over 100 feet in the air, but the understanding was that this could drill 50 feet per hour. So this would get these men out much, much sooner than any of the other alternatives. But all three of these plans, A, B, and C, were stymied by the hardness of the rock at the San Jose mine. So while Plan A and Plan C proceeded on their way, trying to get down there, the people with Plan B, the Pennsylvania folks, created what was called a spider to go down the hole. And this was a bit with teeth sticking out from the sides that as it reached the bottom and pressed down against the remains of the old broken drill bit, those teeth would bend around it and, God willing, grab a hold of it and allow them to withdraw the broken pieces. So they show on a video, and what must have been one of the most heartening things they've ever seen. They bring this spider bit up from hundreds of feet underground. They use an oxyacetylene torch to cut off a couple of these teeth, and the broken piece of the previous bit fell out. So they were able to replace it with a new bit and go down and start again. In the meantime, the men in the hole were in need of having not only their nutritional needs, but also their emotional needs taken care of. There was a phone line sent down. Another 3-inch hole, by the way, had reached them. So even though the one 3-inch hole was being used by Plan B, there was another 3-inch hole they could still communicate and send down nutrition. They sent down a projector on a fiber optic cable that allowed them to project a soccer game onto the wall. Chile was playing the Ukraine, so they were able to see this in real time. But still, they continued to live in these tough conditions, and there was concern about their health because one of the guys was 61 years old, another one of the guys had high blood pressure. You know, would they get down to them in time for all 33 of those men to get out alive? Plan B kept going. Plan C had problems. Plan A eventually was withdrawn even as a contender. Its progress was so slow. But on October 2nd of 2010, Plan B's 28-inch bit broke through to the men. Now, there was a rescue capsule already on hand, something that could be winched down on a cable and somebody could get in and close the door. And it was tapered at both ends so it wouldn't get caught on the sides of the hole. Within 10 days, the New York Times reported that all 33 men, surprised how much this moves me, all 33 men were rescued from the mine. The president of Chile was on hand. The last guy out was the head of the crew that was down there. He brought souvenir rocks for people up when he was brought up. One of the guys who working on that Pennsylvania rig that saved these men said, "This is the hardest job I've ever been on. It fought us the whole way." So I want to thank Naked Science on YouTube. I want to thank the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Shram Inc., and Center Rock Inc. for this inspiring story. This is an inspiring story too, but perhaps a little bit dicier to listen to. Hookworm. Okay. Hookworms are parasites that live in the small intestine. Wait, it gets better. They have a bizarre life cycle. They live in contaminated soil, and they get into the human body through bare feet, usually through the thin, soft skin between the toes. Then they travel around in the body. They finally find their way to the small intestine where they grow. They come out in your poop, and they infect the soil again. The reason they're called hookworms is that the head of the worm, the anterior end as they put it, is slightly hooked over like that. And they have, I guess they could also be called this because they have really sharp teeth they use to lodge into the side of the small intestine where they feed on your nutrients, drink your blood, cause horrible symptoms like belly pain, diarrhea, loss of appetite, weight loss, feeling tired, anemia from blood loss, because when these things start to reproduce in there, they allow so much blood to get through the walls of the intestine and to pass out through your digestive tract that you actually become anemic. The weird thing is, the ancient Greeks and also the Rockefeller Foundation website, and you'll see why that's significant in a minute, said that one of the symptoms is a tendency to eat dirt. Now, I'd like to know, and if you know, please comment below. Do you know this is because there is iron in the soil, and this is the body's attempt to supplement the iron that it's losing through this anemic state? Or is this the parasite modifying the host's behavior to increase infection by getting more hookworm into you? Or is that statement simply false, that it doesn't make you eat dirt after all? But what a bizarre symptom. So in 1910, 40% of the population of the southern United States was estimated to have hookworm. There was a photo on the Rockefeller Foundation website that's really disturbing. This emaciated woman with a giant belly, and it does not look like the belly of someone who's pregnant. It looks like a beer gut that goes all the way up to like right below her sternum. And this was bloating from this infection of hookworms. So there was a doctor and scientist named Charles Wardell Stiles who had a plan to eradicate the hookworm, but he needed funding. So he gave a lecture on the subject to the Rockefeller Foundation, at which John D. Rockefeller, the founder of the feast, the founder of Rockefeller Oil, was present, in addition to some of his sons who were decision makers in the company at that time. They pledged $1 million to set up the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, the RSC, and support Charles Wardell Stiles' work. So they made it their goal, and nothing like going big, to eradicate hookworm in the southern United States. Now, what this reminds me of is the efforts of the Gates Foundation in the modern era, trying to target certain diseases, applying organizational skills learned in business to solving public health problems. The RSC, and that's hilarious to me as an actor because that to me says Royal Shakespeare Company, but in this case it's the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, took a three-pronged approach to map the prevalence of hookworm in various parts of 9 southern states, to cure the hookworm in mobile dispensaries in cooperation with local and state boards of health, and to educate the public about the idea of infection and how it is spread, and to encourage latrine building, because since these things pass out through the digestive tract, that's part of the life cycle of these hookworms. And if people use latrines instead of just using the open ground, it reduces the prevalence of hookworms. So at first, Southerners were offended and distrustful. But they came around because within about a year, it was clear that this was working. And so public opinion shifted. But I can understand their distrustfulness, because here are these Northerners, the Rockefellers, coming in. And the foundation website to this day says they believe that hookworm was, quote, a prime reason for the alleged backwardness of the region and its people. I can see why you wouldn't necessarily welcome people who want to help you on those terms. However, the work of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission worked, even though some people claimed that hookworm didn't exist. So that was quite a public relations obstacle to overcome. The treatment was what they called a vermifuge, and that verma thing is like a Latin prefix referring to worms, like vermicelli, looks like worms. It's a kind of pasta, and so that's why it's called that. Anyway, a vermifuge is a worm killer, followed by a purge. Sounds pretty unpleasant. And at this point, it was still less than 100 years since an Italian scientist, speaking of vermicelli, had identified these worms in an autopsy, so that they even knew that hookworms were a thing. So the vermifuge that they used was a medicine called thymol, which was at first derived from thyme. Maybe it's called thymol, Thyme, or it could also have synthetic sources. Unfortunately, it had side effects like it tasted terrible, and some other side effects. I don't remember what they were, but it made kids not want to take it. So they introduced an alternative, oil of chenopodium, which is derived from a common roadside weed. It was already used to treat roundworm. And this was something, as the Rockefeller efforts spread beyond the United States into the whole world, it was used more widely, this oil of chenopodium, but after a long time was eventually withdrawn from use because it had a risk for children under the age of 12, that it could cause death. So it was hard for health people to let go of this drug because, at least in the result, in the case of roundworms, which were large enough to be seen by the naked eye, if you gave somebody oil of chenopodium, the results were, shall we put it delicately, immediate and visible, which was a real selling point in getting people to take the drug. It really sold it as a cure. You couldn't see hookworm with the naked eye, but oil of chenopodium treated it, but unfortunately too often killed young patients. So in 1914, some of the leaders of the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission said that they should close it because they had succeeded, and that local boards of health could take over with the work they had started, which had always been the intention. So they shifted their efforts to the worldwide eradication of hookworm using the same model. Now, Stanford University's website says that the Rockefeller Foundation efforts were not successful in eliminating hookworm, but its treatment model was helpful in future efforts to eradicate not only that disease, but other diseases as well. So education was an important part of it. Getting back to the earlier point of some Southerners saying it didn't exist, there was a broader goal in the whole thing, to get people worldwide to believe that microorganisms cause disease, which seems so obvious to us now, but was not an accepted idea back then. That a lab-based medicine could diagnose and treat disease, and that modern hygiene things like toilets could have a great health virtue. So I want to thank the Rockefeller Foundation website, WebMD, and stanford.edu for information contributing to this story. No air conditioning. Speaking of issues in warmer places, the British lyricist and playwright Noel Coward has a famous song called Mad Dogs and Englishmen. Now, this is very politically incorrect, but since it does make fun of his own folks, the Englishmen, as well as it does of many of the people who lived in the other areas of the British Empire, I'll repeat a little bit of the lyrics for you. It was from 1931, and it talked about the relationship between the English colonizers and their colonial subjects in equatorial regions. At 12 noon, the natives swoon, and no further work is done. but mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the noonday sun. So the point is not the British disregard for heat or anything having to do with the work ethic of the local people, but rather something Coward no doubt observed in the warmer parts of the world, that the hottest parts of the day were less productive time. And that the British decision perhaps to have afternoon tea to give yourself a stimulant, right, when everybody else was getting ready to go to sleep, was perhaps one of the reasons that they would be crazy enough to go out in the noonday sun. Anyway, energy.gov says that air conditioning is one of the most important inventions of modern times. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s in a house without air conditioning. And I'll tell you, it was hard to sleep on summer nights in New Jersey, even with the luxury of an attic fan that, as long as we kept all our doors and windows open, kept a steady flow of air being pulled in through the windows and out through the attic. Still got pretty hot. So it reminds me that it wasn't that long ago that a lot of people didn't have air conditioning in the United States. In the 1840s, and I'm amazed it was this early, there was a doctor in Florida named John Gorey who looked for a solution to what he called the evils of high temperatures, which included malaria, although I doubt there was any intention of air conditioning the outdoors, but okay. So he came up with the idea of creating ice, which back in those days had to be imported from the north. Now, how on earth that would ever work, I don't know. But to create ice by means of a compressor powered by horse or wind. He patented this idea, but he never developed it commercially. So we have to jump ahead to see the next major advance in air conditioning, which was Willis Carrier. In 1902, he was tasked by his boss, and by the way, he worked for a foundry, which seems to be an odd place for this to be happening, tasked by his boss with solving a humidity problem in a printing company, a lithography company in Brooklyn, New York. So he created an apparatus for treating air for both its humidity and its temperature. And after making several advances with this, he broke off, and with several of his engineers, he left the company he worked for to form Carrier Engineering Company. So some of their, it probably won't surprise you to hear that some of the earliest units were very large, bulky, and not very efficient. And some of the earliest customers were movie theaters. But what they would do is they would take these air conditioning systems and hook them to the ventilation systems that were created solely to heat the space. So cold air came in through the vents in the floor, which meant that sometimes people in movies back in those days, their feet were so cold they would wrap their feet up so their feet wouldn't be freezing, whereas the people up in the balcony were still sweltering. But finally, in 1922 was the first place where a theater got it right. And I think all of us are accustomed to being a little bit cold in movie theaters, but not in the way it used to be. And in 1922, in a theater in Los Angeles, they got it right, which I presume was that they tailored the ventilation system not only to serve the needs of heating, which maybe weren't even necessary in Los Angeles, but to serve the needs of air conditioning. So when I look back as an actor, when I look back into old plays, I see some of the pre-air conditioning conditions that people lived in, complaints about the heat. I see them in movies too. Have you ever seen the famous movie 12 Angry Men? About 12 guys in a jury room deciding what to do about a case. One of the reasons they're angry is that they're hot. And there's a shot of these hot men sitting around the jury room. There was a fan blowing in the corner, and one of the guys idly balls up a piece of paper because he's bored, throws it at the fan, bounces off the blades of the fan, hits another guy in the head. So the heat was amplifying the anger of these 12 angry men. The famous play by Tennessee Williams, A Streetcar Named Desire. Blanche Dubois is constantly taking baths, cool baths, to the great irritation of Stanley Kowalski, who has a line, "Toots, get out of the bathroom." You can find clues in architecture. Heavy awnings over windows are a way of keeping the noonday sun out of the house. I stayed in a hotel in Rome once when I was shooting a commercial, the Hotel Mediterraneo, which I heard was Mussolini's favorite hotel. I looked it up recently, I couldn't find it, but I was there in the late 90s. And it had these, what I guess were stylish kind of Art Deco metal louvers over every window, which I presume were a step forward in keeping the heat out of the rooms, but certainly impinged on the view. And I've lived in a couple of towns. I lived in a small town in New Jersey where the building inspector said that at one time that town had a couple of hundred illegal summer kitchens in the basements of homes. This is just something people would do, and the basement didn't meet the code requirements of a kitchen in terms of ventilation or fire egress or probably even electrical service or anything, but people would do it because it got so doggone hot in a ground level kitchen in the summertime. So they would just set up some stuff in the basement and move their whole kitchen life down to the basement for the summer. A couple of hundred of them. And these things were total fire traps. In the Old South, it was not uncommon for a more well-off person to have a cookhouse that was separate from the main house to keep all the heat of cooking out of the heat of the house in the summertime. So Willis Carrier was our first great innovator that created a practical air conditioning system that could be used at a commercial and industrial level. And then as time went on, competitors came in, including General Electric. And one of the things that was created was chlorofluorocarbons. Now, I mentioned that air conditioning includes a compressor. Well, this was a refrigerant, something that could be used in this compression process to take heat out of a room. Now, those are bad guys probably in our era, in the modern era, because chlorofluorocarbons deplete the ozone layer, but they didn't know that back then. And one of the big advantages of CFCs was that they weren't flammable. Now, that's something that never even occurred to me. That in the old days, air conditioners had refrigerants in them that could catch fire. Good Lord. Thank you, CFCs, although I'm glad we found even better substitutes now. So in the 1940s, they finally created a residential-sized air conditioner that was affordable, and air conditioning began to spread into private homes. So looking back, as just small testaments to how important this invention has been in human life, is that there is the Carrier Dome in Syracuse, New York, an athletic facility named after the company that bears Willis Carrier's name. And by the way, Carrier Corporation is no longer housed in the Northeast. Its offices are in Florida, Palm Beach Gardens. A sign that first innovator was onto something when he said that things were needed to control the evils of extreme temperatures down in his part of the world. So we now have the technology to live our indoor life in almost exactly the same way year-round. We're very lucky to have that, and I'm grateful for it, because back in the old days, things were a little bit worse. Thanks for listening. I'm Jim Reilly. Like and comment below, and have a good night.